It's your turn.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and I'd like to thank the Legacy Research Institute for organizing this wonderful symposium, for having us here. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is basic information, which most of you probably already know. So without much ado, I will start. So, okay. So at the time that Rabban Sauma and his disciple Marcos, the future Catholicos Patriarch Mar Yabhallaha III, made their journey west from China, the Church of the East's spiritual empire had arguably reached its greatest territorial extent. As such, not only did the two monks visit numerous Christian communities along their extensive travels, but the latter's patriarchal consecration in 1281 was attended by a total of up to 11 metropolitans and 24 bishops that came from dioceses located along the Silk Road and Spice Route between the Levant and China. For many of these ecclesiastical provinces, this was the last time that they are mentioned in the historical record, as the Church of the East had already begun to decline even before the Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258. Indeed, Yahballaha's patriarchate was a turbulent one, with Christians having to navigate the fluctuating policies of successive Mongol rulers. It was thus often marred by violent anti-Christian pogroms and accompanied by the destruction of many churches and monasteries by Muslim mobs in various urban centers. I will explore the religious topography and extent of the Church of the East, as illustrated in the history of Mār Yahballāhā and Rabban Sauma, Budge's translation. I also have Professor Borbone's, but Budge's was more easy to access online. It's a big book, I couldn't have the book with me everywhere. Anyhow, as well as other contemporary and secondary sources, noting the Church's gradual decline in the decades and centuries, let's say, that both preceded and followed Yahballāh's elevation to the patriarchal throne. It will thus provide a snapshot of a flourishing church that was on the verge of near annihilation at the hands of Tamerlane around a century later. Now, such a study is essential in understanding this critical period in the history of a church that once rivaled those of Rome and Byzantium and is now one of the smallest and most modest, let's say, of Eastern Christianity. So, sometime between 1275 and 1278, the monks Ṣawmā and Marcos left their hermitage in the Tang mountains to the southwest of Hambalik, as we know present-day Beijing, and set out on what became an epic westward pilgrimage. Both monks appear to have been Ongut, a Turkic people classified as members of the Mongol caste under the Yuan dynasty's laws. They had decided that it would be exceedingly helpful to visit the tombs of the holy martyrs and the fathers, the Catholicoi, and to be blessed by them. Their ultimate goal was to reach Jerusalem in order to receive absolution for their sins. Rabban Sauma, however, opposed his disciple and tried to frighten him with the toil of the journey, the fatigue of traveling, the terror of the ways, and the troubles that would befall them in foreign lands. But Marcus burned to set out on the road. He was certainly no stranger to travel, having already journeyed 15 days from his native town of Kushan, nearly 750 kilometers away, to become Sauma's disciple at the tender young age of 15. Now, this is not the actual road that he would have taken. None of these routes that I'm showing, it's just to give you an idea. Okay? It's sort of for dramatic effect. Anyhow, so whereas Marcus was already in his early 30s, his master was about 20 years his senior, and came from a wealthy family living in Khanbalik before devoting his life to God at the age of 23, reneging on an arranged marriage, and he had lived for 7 years as an ascetic before becoming a spiritual teacher, and he needed a good deal of convincing before he agreed to leave his comfortably stationary monastic life. Somewhat prophetically, Marcus's mind seemed to reveal to him that there were treasures in store for him in the West, and he pressured his master to depart, changing the course of both their lives. Now, the two monks agreed that neither of them should be separated from the other, even if one of them might have to submit to what was evil for his sake. They thus distributed their furniture and possessions among the poor and went to Khanbalik to find travel companions and buy provisions for the journey. Their next stop was Koshang, present-day or near present-day Dongsheng, where local Christians, including Marcus's parents, welcomed them and escorted them to the church. When they realized, however, that the monks planned to travel further west to Jerusalem, they tried to convince them otherwise. Failing this, the local rulers provided them with animals, gold, silver, clothes, and rugs to make their journey easier. From there, they came to the unnamed city of Tangut, which would have been the capital of the Tangut area, and which also Dr. Lee has identified with Yinchuan, present-day Yinchuan, where local Christians again provided them with various gifts before sending them on their way. Now, 2 months later, they arrived at a barren district called Loton, which Dr. Lee has identified with present-day Luntai, and where they were delayed for 6 months due to a war between Kublai Khan and a warlord named Oko, who in his turn had devastated the area. From there, they proceeded to Kashgar, which they found plundered and empty of its inhabitants, continuing on to Talas. I think there were 2 routes to go to Talas. I think this would have been the shortest one. Present-day Taraz in Kazakhstan, where Kublai Khan's nephew, Kaidu, was encamped, obtaining a written order from him that they could pass through his territory safely. So I guess he gave them a paisa, or gerege. Now, after much difficulty on the roads, the 2 monks arrived in Khorasan around 1279-1280, where they stopped at the monastery of Saint Zion near Tus, and were welcomed by the local bishop and his monks. From there, they continued to the Ilkhanate capital of Maraha in Iranian Azerbaijan, where they found Catholicos Patriarch Denha I. After staying with him for some days, they requested leave to go on to Baghdad, and he sent them on their way with a letter of instruction and a guide. Together they travelled to the cathedral of Koche, where all of the Church of the East's Catholicos Patriarchs are consecrated, St. Mari's Monastery at Der Qunni, St. Ezekiel's Monastery near Dapok in the Beth Garme region, and there you can see the journey south of Baghdad, and then they journeyed to St. Ezekiel's Monastery near Dapok, then to Erbil, Mosul, Sinjar, and you can see the probable route that they would have taken, maybe even along the Tigris is also possible, from Sinjar up to Nisibis, and then from Nisibis to Mardin, St. Eugene's Monastery on Mount Isla, and Gazarta, or present-day Jizre. So from there, they finally retired to the monastery of St. Michael of Tar'el, where they purchased a cell and settled for a while. Now this, however, did not please Denha I, who preferred that they instead reside with him to bring benefit and peace to the whole community. He was in fact so impressed by his visitors' credentials and their obvious links to the Mongol rulers that he asked them to carry a message to the Ilkhan Abaqa, asking the ruler to confirm his status as the Church of the East's supreme leader. The monks agreed to do so as long as they could send the confirmation back with an escort while they continued on to Jerusalem. When they reached Abaqa's encampment near Tabriz, Abaqa Khan granted the Catholicos Patriarch's credentials and ordered his officials to aid them in their onward journey to Jerusalem. After visiting the Armenian city of Ani and continuing on to Georgia to find a safe passage to the holy city, several locals warned them not to travel further due to dangers posed by robbers, as well as a war between the Mongols and Mamluks. Instead, the 2 travelers returned to their superior at Maraha by late 1280. Now, after consoling them that they had received blessings from all the churches, monasteries, and shrines that they had already visited, making their efforts equivalent to a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the Catholicos Patriarch decided to appoint Marcos a metropolitan for Katay and Ong and make Rabban Sauma Visitor General, with the intention of sending them both back to their own countries. Finding themselves unworthy and unwilling to return by the same arduous journey that they had already travelled, imagine they'd already gone all this way, they didn't want to go back. So they instead declared their wish to live out the remainder of their lives in a monastery. Now the Holy Father, however, insisted and went ahead with his plans, consecrating Marcos with the new name Yahballāhā, given by God. Before they could be sent back home, though, military conflict had broken out along the route between rival kings on either side of the Oxus River, the present-day Amudarya, making the return journey too dangerous and delaying their departure. Instead, both opted to remain at the St. Michael of Tarail monastery, where they lived for over a year. Eventually, Yahballāhā resigned himself to his lot and decided to visit the Catholicos Patriarch in Baghdad in order to receive his blessing, as well as a mitre and pastoral staff, in order to finally leave for his post. By pure chance, however, when he arrived, he discovered that he had died after a long illness. So he made it to the church just in time for the Patriarch's funeral, which is said to have taken place on the 24th of February 1281. And it was probably also the last burial of an East Syriac Patriarch in the city of Baghdad. Again, the course of the two friends' lives was changed completely. So the following day, the prelates that were present at the patriarchal residence gathered to elect a suitable successor. These included the metropolitans of Ilam, or Ahwaz, Tangut, Tirhan, and Ture, which I identify with Al-Jibal in Arabic, or Hamadan. With them were many of Baghdad's Christian elders, priests, nobles, governors, scribes, lawyers, and physicians, and after much deliberation they chose Yahballāhā because the kings who held the steering poles of the government of the whole world were Mongols, and there was no man except Yahballāhā who was acquainted with their manners and customs, and their policy of government and their language. The nominee, however, hesitated because he found himself deficient in education and ecclesiastical doctrine, as well as a bad public speaker, being ignorant of Syriac and Arabic. But he agreed when they persisted in their request. Now, he must have realized that his knowledge of Mongol society could help him protect the church and allow it to build strong relations with Asia's contemporary overlords. In other words, his election was politically practical. After this, he returned to his master at St. Michael of Tarail's monastery, and together with some bishops and monks, they proceeded to Abaqa Khan's encampment at Siyar Kuh, the Black Mountain, to receive his consent. Now this Igil Khan duly granted, bestowing him with his own cloak and chair of state, as well as a royal parasol, a golden tablet of authority, a written decree, and the great seal given to his recently deceased predecessor by Monkey Khan, as well as a large sum of money to cover his consecration expenses. Now, when you realize where a lot of these prelates came from, this money probably helped to pay for those expenses. So, this patriarchal consecration, which took place at the Cathedral of Koche on the 9th of November, roughly, when Yahballāhā was 37 years of age, was one of the largest assemblies of prelates in the Church of the East's history, and was remarkable for the considerable distances travelled by many of those present. Now the ceremony was led by Mār Yahballāhā, Metropolitan of Ahwaz, who held the rank of Guardian of the Apostolic Throne. He was joined by the Metropolitans of the Church's interior ecclesiastical provinces of Nisibis and Armenia, Erbil, Mosul and Nineveh, as well as Dalhok and Beth Garmay. With them were the Metropolitans of the Church's exterior provinces of Tripoli and Jerusalem, Samarkand, and Azerbaijan, probably Tabriz. To these must be added the Metropolitans of Tangut, Tirhan and Ture, or Hamadan, who were already in Baghdad when the previous Catholicos Patriarch passed away. Assisting them was a total of 24 bishops, including those of Salamas, Ushnuk and Susa, whose names are in Bijan's 1895 edition of the text, as well as those of Arni and Hnitha, whose names also appear in the narrative. To these may be added the names of bishops whose names have been mentioned in research by Father John Maurice Fie and David Wilmshurst, those of Rustaqa, Ma'altha, probably in Beth Nuhadra rather than the one on the Upper Zab, Dasan, Akhlat, Arzon, Socotra, Beth Daron or Radan, Hassan Kaif, Tella and Barbille or Marga, Maiparqat and Amid, Balad and Jaslona, Mardin, Gazarta of Beth Zabde, and probably also a young Audisho Barbricha, who would have been Bishop of Sinjar at the time. We can also assume the presence of bishops whose names are not known in the historical record, from Urmia, Beth Bagash, Beth Waziq, Houghton, and Thamanon or Qardu, since we know that these dioceses still existed around that time. Significantly, it seems that the nearly 8.5 months between Dinha I's death and Yahballaha III's consecration were enough for the news to reach many of the exterior provinces and for some of their metropolitans to reach Baghdad. Apart from the metropolitans of Elam and Tangut, who were already present, those of Samarkand and Socotra had also made it there. So here you can see where most of these dioceses are located. As you can see, most of them are in northern Mesopotamia, or at least north of Baghdad. And here you can see where some of them came from. Obviously, Marcus, later Yahballāhā, was the metropolitan of Cathay-on. He never went to his diocese. But you had the metropolitan of Tangut, the metropolitan of Samarkand, and the bishop of Socotra, which is an island off the coast of Yemen, and also the others that I mentioned. So, let's talk about the Church of the East around that time. At Yahballāhā's patriarchal consecration, he had inherited a church that had already been in decline since the 10th century. Initially, the Church of the East had its greatest expansion in the 5th century, experiencing some decline in the 7th and 8th centuries due to the spread of Islam. Its last major period of growth, however, was in the 9th century, especially under Timothy the Great, when it had reached its maximum extent and had the largest number of metropolitan provinces and dioceses. This was due to its expansion both eastward along the Silk Road and spice routes, as well as westwards to lands that had previously been under hostile Byzantine rule, as Mesopotamian merchants established new trading communities, Sasanian immigrants fled the Islamic conquest, and missionaries endeavored to spread the Christian faith. With the increase in conversions to Islam from the 10th century onward, and especially after the fallout from the Crusades beginning in the 11th century, the Church of the East saw its greatest period of decline in the 12th century. This recurred in the century after Yahballāhā's consecration due to the Mongol rulers' conversion to Islam and the ascendance of the xenophobic Ming dynasty in China. So by the 15th century, the Church of the East survived only in northern Mesopotamia and southern India. Most of the Church of the East's exterior provinces in the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, and the Caucasus had already collapsed by Yahballāhā's time due to the spread of Islam between the 7th and 12th centuries. For instance, although Beth Qatraye appears together with India as the 13th in a list of Church of the East dioceses in a collection of canons attributed to 12th century patriarch Emir III, Abu Halim, its 5 suffragan dioceses were last mentioned in the 7th century, soon after the spread of Islam. In addition, the diocese of Sana'a in Yemen, mentioned in the 2nd quarter of the 9th century, was never heard of again, leaving only that of Socotra, which fell silent in the 14th century. The metropolitan see of Ray in northern Iran's Tabaristan, which reached its peak during the 8th and 9th centuries, was last mentioned in 1111. And its 4 known suffragan dioceses progressively disappeared between 823 and 1008. Similarly, the Church of the East's small dioceses of Aran in Caucasian Azerbaijan, first mentioned in the 6th century, disappear after the last mention of Barda'a in 1137. And you can see here where Beth Qatraya was, around the Gulf, around Qatar, also Aran here, and then Tabaristan, Ray, Gilan and Dilan. Now, the Persian heartland in southern Iran was also long gone. Most of its 8 suffragan dioceses were last mentioned in the 9th century, and the province's last known metropolitan appears in the historical record nearly a century and a half prior to Yahballāhā's consecration. The archdiocese was last mentioned by Elia III in the 12th century. As for the exterior province of Damascus, which really was all the areas that were gained after the Islamic expansion in the Levant, it was elevated to an archdiocese around 800, and its 7 known suffragan dioceses in Levantine Syria, Cilicia, Cappadocia, Palestine and Egypt seem to have disappeared between 893 and 1092. Probably after the Mongol defeat at Ain Jalut in 1260, the sea must have shifted to the coastal city of Tripoli, and after the fall of Acre in 1291 to Famagusta in Cyprus, persisting until its last bishop's forced conversion to Catholicism in 1445. Now further afield, the province of Beth Tuptaye or Tibet is never mentioned again after its first metropolitan's consecration around 792 by Timothy the Great. On the other hand, that of Beth Turkaye, which we were discussing yesterday, might be Akpeshim or Suyab, was also created by Timothy, and it is last mentioned in 1008. Now, in terms of the interior ecclesiastical provinces, Beth Arbaya and Arabin in northern Mesopotamia were still strong during Yahballāhā's patriarchate and would only decline later in the 14th and 15th centuries. Not only had Adiabin been divided into 2 archdioceses since 1189, Mosul and Erbil, but Azerbaijan, or Iranian Azerbaijan, I should say, which had previously been a suffragan diocese, had its rank elevated to that of an archdiocese with its see in Tabriz by 1265. This indicates that the population in the area was growing significantly and required better ecclesiastical administration. Further south, however, things were not going as well. The small archdiocese of Beth Garmay, for instance, was also the least stable, as its metropolitan see was moved from Shahrgard to Kirkuk, to Shahrazor, and then to Daqoq between the 3rd and 10th centuries. Although it reached its peak during the 6th to 12th centuries, it declined sharply from the 12th century onwards, losing 8 of its suffragan dioceses. It and its suffragan diocese of Beth Waziq are last mentioned in 1318. Beth Armaye, so you can see basically where these dioceses are. Arbayistan is Beth Arbaye, Nod Ardakhshira Khan is Adiabin, and Garmagan is Beth Garmay. These are the old Sasanian names for those provinces. So, Beth Armaye, or the Patriarchal Archdiocese, at which time 12 of its suffragan dioceses are never mentioned again. So, by Catholicos Patriarch Avdisha III's consecration in 1139, all the bishops of Beth Armaye had died, and their seats were vacant, something which had never happened before. In 1222, the guardianship of the vacant patriarchal throne, for centuries a privilege of the suffragan bishops of Kashgar, was in the hands of the metropolitans of Ilam or Ahwaz. Nevertheless, it appears that small Christian communities with active churches and monasteries persisted in some places, such as at Piroz Shapur or Anbar on the Euphrates, where a manuscript was copied in 1276, despite its last bishop having been mentioned in 1111. So, there you can see Beth Armaye, in the Sasanian period known as Asuristan. So by the time of Yahballāh's consecration, the suffragan diocese of Tirhan had been elevated to an archdiocese, and with the other dioceses that survived, Beth Daron, they were both well to the north of Baghdad, and these are... Additionally, the small interior ecclesiastical province of Meishan, with its 4 suffragan dioceses at the very south of Mesopotamia, prospered in the 8th to 10th centuries, despite the Islamic invasion and rule, but gradually declined from the 11th century onward and appears to have been extinct by the late 13th century. The last known incumbent of its metropolitan see, first located at Prath-Meishan and since 754 at Basra, is mentioned in 1222, and it appears that the entire archdiocese had lapsed and been suppressed by the time that Rabban Sauma and Marcus had even arrived in Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, Fiye asserted that in 1316 the Metropolitan of Basra was always the third at the consecration of the Patriarch, but he wasn't present at the consecration of Timothy II. Now, there you can see where Meishan is. And it's right next to Beth Huzayeh, or Ilam. So in Iran, the interior ecclesiastical province of Beth Huzayeh, also known as Ilam or Khuzestan, reached its peak in the 6th and 7th centuries and gradually began to decline after the 8th century due to the local Christian population's Islamization. By Yahballāh's consecration, it had lost 7 of its suffragan dioceses, maintaining only that of Susa, and these are not mentioned again after 1318 at all. Further north, the Church of the East's presence in historic media, renamed Al-Jibal, or the mountains, by Arab geographers, appears to have peaked during the 8th and 10th centuries, but declined in the 11th and 12th centuries, when 3 of the ecclesiastical province's 4 suffragan dioceses are last mentioned. After 1175, so here you can see this area around Hamadan and Nihawan, Dinawar, Halwan, which is called Jabal or Jibal. After 1175, the metropolitan see was transferred to Hamadan, where it persisted until the end of the 13th century. A metropolitan of Ture, the mountains, probably a translation of Arabic Al-Jibal, is last mentioned at Yahballāh's election, and he may have resided in Hamadan with a very small number of adherents. During his subsequent patriarchate, however, it was the scene of anti-Christian riots on more than one occasion. In 1297, the patriarch remarked that the places whereon the metropolitan's cell and the church once stood is wholly impossible to point out. Further west, the Church of the East's archdioceses in Khorasan and Segestan, based at Merv and Herat respectively, appear to have suffered greatly after the 7th century Islamic conquest of the area, and especially in the 10th century. During this period, 6 of Khorasan's 7 suffragan dioceses and all 4 of Segestan's are mentioned for the last time, and no names of its metropolitans are known after 1019. It is possible that the archdiocese survived until 1316, when Abdisha of Nisibis titled it that of Merv and Nishapur. Indeed, during their travels, the monks Sauma and Marcos were offered hospitality by the unnamed Bishop of Tus near Nishapur, confirming the presence of a Christian community in Khorasan, however much reduced. Moreover, whereas the last metropolitan of Herat was mentioned in 1072, the city's remaining Christians received a copy of the Diatessaron in 1291 or 1295, meaning that the Church of the East maintained a community in Herat, which is now in Afghanistan, during Yahballāh's patriarchate. Again, the archdiocese is last mentioned in Abdisha of Nisibis's lists at the beginning of the 14th century. After that, we have nothing. On the other hand, the Church of the East appears to have re-established itself in China during the 13th century, the second quarter of the 13th century, through the migration of many of its adherents from Central Asia and Mongolia, east and southward, so that by the first half of the 14th century, the church had communities in many Chinese cities. The former ecclesiastical province of Bet Sinaye, founded in the 8th century and suppressed under the Song dynasty, was therefore resurrected in the form of a new archdiocese named for Cathay, i.e. northern China, and Ong, the territory of the Onggut Turks, with its see in Khanbalik and probably several suffragan dioceses. In 1253, William of Rubruck mentioned a Nestorian bishop in the town of Segin or Shijing, present-day Datong in Shaanxi province. Moreover, we've already seen the tomb of a Church of the East bishop named Solomon or Shlimun, who died in 1313, that has recently been discovered at Chunju, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, in Fujian province. And his epitaph described him as the administrator of the Christians and Manichaeans of Manzi, or southern China. So another ecclesiastical province for Tangut covered northwestern China, and its metropolitan appears to have had his see at Yinchuan and maybe even later at Al-Malik, which were the region's chief cities. I know they're very far away from each other, but it seems that the Tangut must have moved west, I'm not sure. Anyhow, it apparently had a number of suffragan dioceses, as Metropolitan Simon Bar Khalid was arrested by Dinha I shortly before his death, together with a number of his bishops. Now, it appears, however, not to have survived the mid-14th century, and in 1339-1340, Papal Envoy John of Marignoli mentioned the forcible conversion of Al-Malik's Christians to Islam. The Church of the East communities in China existed under Mongol protection, and it appears that their congregations consisted mostly of ethnic Mongols, Turks, Uyghurs, and Sogdians, with a very few Han Chinese converts, and possibly smaller numbers of Assyrian, Arab, or Persian merchants. These were dispersed when all foreign Christians were expelled from China soon after the Mongol Yuan dynasty's overthrow in 1368 and the Ming dynasty's ascendancy. A heavy political reliance on patronage by the Yuan imperial court and a lack of Chinese Bible translations may have thus influenced the Ming's negative policies toward the Christians. It appears, however, that some were allowed to convert to Buddhism and remain in certain parts of Inner Mongolia and adjacent areas of nearby provinces. Dr. Bolorma presented about them last year at Uzbekistan. Now, in Central Asia, the Metropolitan Archdiocese of Kashgar and Nevaket, created by Elia III in the 12th century, appears to have persisted until the mid-14th century, when it is mentioned in a list of the Church of the East's provinces and dioceses by Amr ibn Matta. It seems that the province was first created with its see at Kashgar, and this was later transferred to Nevaket. When Marco Polo visited Kashgar in the 1270s, he found many Nestorians with several churches in the towns and villages surrounding it. But in 1279, when the monks Sauma and Marcos passed through it, they found the city empty of its inhabitants because it had already been plundered by the enemy. On the other hand, the ecclesiastical province of Samarkand, founded by Catholicos Patriarch Slivas Kha in the 8th century, is last mentioned in 1281 when its metropolitan assisted in Yahballaha's consecration. In the decade prior, Marco Polo visited the city and reported Christians as a significant proportion of its population. He also described the main local church dedicated to St. John the Baptist, which may have survived until the mid-14th century. Now, a Church of the East Metropolitan Archdiocese in the islands of the sea, probably a reference to the East Indies, maybe even Japan, maybe the Philippines, existed in between the 11th and 14th centuries. Abdishov Nisibis has lists of ecclesiastical provinces that he compiled at the beginning of the 14th century, and it includes the islands of the sea between Dabal or Java, Sin, northern China, and Masin, southern China. implying that it may have covered some of the islands between Japan and the East Indies, or what we know today as Indonesia. In 1503, when Catholicos Patriarch Ilya V consecrated a number of bishops in response to a request from a delegation to Malabar's St. Thomas Christians, one of them was for India and the islands of the sea between Dabaq, Sin and Masin. India, which had maintained its relations with the Patriarchal See of Seleucia Ctesiphon since the 3rd century, had a metropolitan named Jacob at the turn of the 14th century. He is mentioned together with Yahballāhā the Turk, whom it curiously describes as Yahballāhā V, in the colophon of a manuscript completed in June 1301 at the royal city of Krainenor, which appears to have been the center of the archdiocese. Now we don't know, we're sure he wasn't present at the consecration, but we don't know also if he was consecrated by Yahballāhā or maybe had been a metropolitan beforehand. Now, the Church of the East has maintained its presence in India to this very day and would have had a much larger following had it not been for the interference of Portuguese colonists who introduced the Catholic Inquisition in the 16th century and forced a large number of the faithful to submit to the Pope at the Synod of Ulaanbaatar in 1599. Now, conclusions and final thoughts. During his 36-year patriarchate, Yahballaha III ordained a total of, well, originally I thought bishops, but then I saw someone today who had a slide saying priests, bishops, and metropolitans. So, in the 1320s, his biographer praised the efforts and the progress made by the Church of the East in converting the Indians, Chinese, and Turks, without suggesting that this achievement was under threat. In 1348, Amr ibn Matta listed 27 metropolitan provinces stretching from Jerusalem to China. Nevertheless, the Church of the East had already been in major decline for at least the past 2 centuries in most of its historic areas, with the exception of northern Mesopotamia, southern India, and East Asia. At the same time, Yahballaha headed the church during severe persecutions under the reigns of Ilkhan's Tekuder, Ghazan, and his successor Al-Jeloo, who were converts to Islam. This particularly intensified after Acre's fall to Muslims, which was perceived as a victory of Islam over Christianity and tilted popular opinion in the Ilkhanate toward the former. Muslims were thus brought to dominance, and the resulting persecution of Christians at Baghdad, Tabriz, Maragha, and Hamadan, which Yahballaha tried unsuccessfully to end, was accompanied by the destruction or confiscation of churches, their conversion into mosques, and even the pillaging of the patriarchal residence. Although personally on good terms with Yahballaha, Al-Jeloo was especially unwilling to end the persecutions and even carried them out himself. Things came to a head with the massacre of Erbil's Christians in 1310, after which Yahballaha gave up and retired to the monastery he had built near Maragha. In the end, all his joy was temporary, his power was a curse, and his story did not have a happy ending. In contrast to the 11 metropolitans and 24 bishops present at Yahballaha's consecration in 1281, only 3 metropolitans and 8 bishops were in attendance at that of his successor Timothy II in 1318. These were the metropolitans of Ilam, Nisibis, and Mosul, as well as the bishops of Beth Garmay, Tirhan, Balad, Beth Waziq, Sinjar, Hnifa, Beth Darun, as well as Marga, or Tilla and Barbil. Timothy himself had been Metropolitan of Erbil before his election to the Patriarchate, and with the exception of Ilam, whose incumbent was present in his capacity as guardian of the Patriarchal throne, all the dioceses represented were in northern Mesopotamia. Similarly, at one time or another between the 15th and early 20th centuries, another 75 dioceses belonging to the Church of the East and its Uniate counterpart, the Chaldean Catholic Church, are recorded as having existed in northern Mesopotamia, in contrast to 6 in Kerala, India, and 2 established by the Chaldean Catholics in Baghdad and Basra during the 19th century. So you can see where all of these bishoprics would have been located, some of them very short-lived. It is thus evident that the intense Islamization of southern Mesopotamia and Iran, gradually spreading to Central Asia, resulted in a Church of the East which was becoming increasingly limited to the population of historic Assyria, with its second major stronghold in southern India. Much weakened by constant conflict and disease, and unable to maintain contact with their mother church in Mesopotamia, its scattered adherents further east in Central Asia and China were dispersed by the Ming dynasty's xenophobic policies, and their remnants gradually converted to Islam and Buddhism after the 14th century. It is truly a miracle and an act of divine intervention that the Church of the East has managed to survive until this day. And personally, I pray that its story will end on a much happier note than that on which Yahballāhā III did. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good. Question? We have time for questions? Yeah. Yes. I want to clarify, if you have the map of Luntai, just clarify some of the struggles I have, yeah? Because he said, I said, I identified Luntai. No, you see, when the map of travel, so when we first had this problem, this word, Luntai, when the Yahballāhā, when the 2 months passed.
No, it's further.
And then the original, before Professor Bourbon's edition, we knew that they say, not this one, there's another clear one.
It was this one, Luntai.
Okay, yeah, that's okay. You have another one? Okay, that's fine. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So, I was thinking, why Chabot says Khotan? And so I thought, at the beginning, it was my struggle. I thought, not possible, because similarly to Luntai, because maybe Chabot was not aware of the Luntai, because of when Genghis Khan conquered the west, there's a Taoist monk traveling with him, and then they always passed the place called Luntai, where he met the king of the Tarsa, Uyghur king of the Tarsa. So clearly there was a Christian community there. But then, but I was not sure, so never published. I never published that. But then, just recently, I read some of for this conference, I wrote about the word Khotan. Khotan, can I write something I can write there? So Khotan, then in the Mongol period, they have a different pronunciation of Khotan. It's very interesting. It's called Uduan. So U is like a wo, you see like this. And then there's another name for Utan. Tuan, Khotan. So it sounds like Khotan, Khotan. So then I was thinking, maybe it's correct, this is Khotan. But it's a little bit unusual, because normally if you look at the travelers of Genghis Khan and the monks, and I think there's another traveler, they always pass Luntai, taking the other road this way, then to Kashgar. But this one to Khotan to Kashgar, but there's also a Silk Road. So still I'm not sure which one, but it doesn't matter anyway at the moment, whether it's Luntai or Khotan. But with your edition, Pierre, you said the Syriac was low.
I did accept the reading Khotan.
Yeah.
I am just there is that. The problem is that yesterday I said we have only 3 manuscripts.
And
sometimes, if there are mistakes, they are present in all the manuscripts. There is the pen somewhere. So what do we find here? As far as I remember, sorry, I have this lo, ton, maybe tau, loton. So already Chabot, and already maybe the first editor, Bejan, suggested Khotan.
Yeah.
Khotan.
Yeah, oh,
Yes.
the L, lamed is K,
But
yeah.
yes, but the problem is that you should. So it seems quite a simple solution, but the solution suggested by Lee is quite interesting. Nevertheless, one should check the context,
Yeah,
and the context say that well, from there they reached, let's say, Khotan. After 2 months of struggle and hardship in that arid steppe. Nobody lives there because it is bitter water. Nothing can be sold there, and along the entire way there are only about 8 days during which drinking water provision can be found. This, by chance, it is exactly what Marco Polo says about Khotan.
Yeah.
Then we have, at the time of their arrival in Khotan, there had just been a conflict between the king of the Khan and the king Oku. The latter, having escaped from the Khan, had arrived there, where he had slaughtered thousands of people. The roads and tracks were interrupted, and the wheat supplies had run out. Since wheat could not be procured, many died of starvation. After, this is interesting, after 6 months, the monks left that place and went to Kashgar. It's quite strange that you don't have anything to eat, but to stay 6 months in the place. Anyway,
But this can be then compensation then, it's not
So
it's an old time.
the historical, the environmental and historical occurrences that are mentioned in the story, do they fit with the identification with Khotan? Also because if you go to this Khotan, you don't need to go to Kashgar to reach the north, because there is the Bedel Pass, which is, sorry, the Bedel Pass is nearby, which is Bedel River. It's quite easy.
Yeah.
You can go by horse.
Yeah.
This is chosen only for political reasons.
Yeah.
But it is the easiest way to reach the north. So when you are here, maybe it's possible, but not necessarily. And so this is not steppe, this is mountain.
Yeah.
So maybe I would like to agree to
But
your suggestion.
no, I'm not sure, because when I found out Wutuan this went for Khotan, then I'm convinced maybe it is Khotan, because then it is lamed, the proposition to Khotan. Yeah, so to Khotan.
Yeah.
So
Maybe the place, maybe is Luntai.
yeah, that's what I was thinking at the
Anyway,
beginning,
when-
but
when-
then I'm not sure, because normally the Chinese always took that road.
Indeed, that's
To,
right.
there's
Yes, but Marco Polo
to
took
the west.
to this one.
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah, southern route.
Going in the same direction
Yeah,
and
yeah.
reaching Kaohsiung or Tanduk and so on.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you know this north and the south end.
Yeah.
If somebody is able to find out, somebody did, the King Oko was identified by Pelliot, for instance. And I think that in my commentary you can find something about it.
Yeah.
So I don't know, when I saw that, I was surprised and I said, that's nice. So it's better to go this way. And then I remembered that the Bedel Pass and also the Torugard, this is Songkol. You can reach the Songkol this way.
Is there a way
Instead going
Okay.
to Kashgar.
Maybe because they have to pass Kashgar because there's a Christian community
Oh, I
there.
don't know.
Yeah, we don't know, but it's very
They
interesting.
don't mention Kashgar.
Yeah.
So this is just an example
Yeah.
of how many things we don't know, and
Yeah.
we can
Yeah.
continue.
And
working
another
on
thing
it.
I want to mention about, you mentioned Tibet, just a comment, because a lot of people, we know, but a lot of people think it is today's Tibet plateau, but actually, in my view, it's not. It is because it's the best, Tuktaye is the land of the Tibetans, which means because during that period, Timothy the Dunhuang area, all this Gansu area was conquered by Tibetans. So under the Tibetan rule.
Yes.
So that's why the best Tuktaye, maybe that Dunhuang, that Gansu area, Tanggud area. So yeah, it's not the Tibetan today, the plateau today. Yeah.
Very
But
interesting.
it's very, very fascinating. Well, that's bring to an end to our discussion. And thank you very much,
Thank you.
Nicholas, and especially big thank you to Mar and for inviting us. This is a conference I really enjoyed because we have really discussions, small, but you can really work on some of the tests, and so I really appreciate it. And I think everybody else shares my view. And thank you so much. And thank you for the Hungarian Embassy to sponsor this and the Legacy Institute. And do you like to say something for tomorrow? Yeah.